We're going to, and Thursday, God willing also, we're going to reply to the misrepresentation that's been applied to the holy, just and good law that was written down by Moses. We shouldn't be surprised that the law of God has come into such disrepute because the age in which we live has been clearly predicted in the Bible. Called in Revelation the attitudes of madness, the spirit of demons, the attitudes of madness of the last days that will work miracles, completely changing the world leading up to Armageddon. Paul predicted that men would be lovers of their own selves, despisers of those that are good. The days of Noah, where there was a great desertion from the things of the truth, violence, evil imaginations and widespread corruption in the earth. The days of Lot, with open immorality, pride, fullness of bread and the abundance of idleness. And we're finding an age in which we live that people are very misinformed and ignorant about God, especially in Western countries like Australia. The great tragedy is that people now think that they can actually make judgments upon the God that created the world and the universe and themselves, and that they have the right to judge God by their modern values. And we shouldn't be surprised that men think they can do that, because the Bible tells us that the natural instincts of the human mind are to boast the desires of one's soul, to renounce Yahweh. And their thoughts, says the psalm, are that there is no God. And men want to believe there is no God because they want to be able to do what comes natural to the flesh. And they don't seek God, they want to do what is natural to the flesh. And so they have to get rid of the God of the Bible. And that's what's happened in the last 25 years in this world, particularly in the Western world, has been the destruction of the respect to the Word of God and to religion generally. And it's come from what we call the anti-religion industry, or the new atheists as they call themselves. And this charge has been led by four particular individuals: Christopher Hitchens, Dave Dennett, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. And they are what's called the Four Horsemen. The media portrays them as the Four Horsemen, picking up a symbol from the Apocalypse, which of course was a historical representation of the downfall of the Roman Empire. But they've called these particular guys the Four Horsemen, and that's the way they've been portrayed, that they've come in to actually destroy the edifice of religion, and particularly Christianity. And you might say to yourself, why are we talking about these people in relation to the law of Moses? Well, the law of Moses happens to be their primary target to push their case. Over the last 20-odd years, they've put out a wave of anti-religion books. Some of you may have read some of these. If you haven't read them, you've heard the philosophies that have been adopted by society that spring from them. And you would be surprised, once you have read these books, how much of the current thinking of our postmodern world has been derived from the works that these guys put down and the false claims they've made about God and the Bible, and some of the correct claims they've made about religion in general. And they've actually put those two things together. They've put all the faults of religion and the Bible on the same page. And of course, we don't stand here to justify religion in general. We stand here to justify the Word of God. Now, the leading person in this group of the Four Horsemen is called Richard Dawkins, a skeptic and an atheist, an evolutionist. His book that he wrote, which is the one which set the whole thing in train, was called The God Delusion, where he set out to convince the world that believing in God was actually self-deception. And of course, he was pushing evolution. The bottom line on what Dawkins was preaching is this, and this is the bus that he drove around England, painted up with those words, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." And you see, what they did is they gave men the justification to be whatever they wanted to be. They did that by destroying in people's mind the confidence that there was a God, that there was a Bible worth believing. And the main target of their hostility and their vitriol was the Old Testament and the law of Moses. This statement I put up the other night without explaining it. But it gives you some idea of where these guys are coming from. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak. A vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser. A misogynistic, which means demeaning for women. Homophobic, racist, infanticidal, commanding the destruction of little children. Genocidal, wiping out whole races of people. Felicicidal, and that means in your own family. Pestilential, megalomaniacal, and etc., etc. And the conclusion he makes in his book is that God is a moral monster. Even if I don't make the kingdom, I would love to be there when these people have to stand in front of the Lord Jesus Christ, just to see what they say then. You know, that's absolute blasphemy against the God of the Bible. This is Christopher Hitchens. His book, God is Not Great. God has all these unalterable laws. And look at this emotional language. The forgotten Canaanites were piteously driven out of their homes to make room for the ungrateful and mutinous children of Israel. Moreover, the Old Testament contains a warrant for trafficking in humans, for ethnic cleansing, for slavery, for bride price, for indiscriminate massacre. But we are not bound by any of it because it was put together by crude, uncultured human animals, by which he means Moses. You see, these people have an agenda. Their challenge basically is this. They deny the existence of God and they use evolution to justify the fact that we are here. They proclaim loudly that religion is the major cause of evil throughout history. They insult God as a disgraceful bully. You know, here he was, making Abraham take his boy, as they think Isaac was, as the pictures all portray him. He was actually about 25. But he took his boy and put him on the altar. That was child abuse, they say. And God required that. You see how they can twist away the beautiful things of the Bible into denying the character of God. And then Sam Harris, his book, The Letter to the Christian Nation. My book is designed to demolish the intellectual and moral pretensions of Christianity in its most committed forms. And he goes on then to quote how the law of Moses had death penalties for things we spoke about the other night. So this campaign has been incredibly successful in getting into the minds of the Western world in particular. It's why religion is generally on the decline through the educated countries, because they've picked up all these vibes and it's become the basis of the postmodern world in which we live. So here are the issues. Yahweh is a jealous God. He will allow no other gods, so he's very jealous about who worships him. He demands constant praise and worship. Therefore, he's, as I said, he's a narcissist. He wants to be constantly praised. Repressive and discriminatory about women and approving the sale of daughters as brides. A merciless genocide of the Canaanites. Slavery is allowed and condoned. Racism. The privileged treatment of the Jewish race above all the other nations. Harsh punishments for supposedly minor crimes. The death penalty for adultery and homosexuals. And they say that, well, God's morals are all out of date with the modern world. And you see, because the world has moved on and changed the boundaries, changed the posts that God put down, they say, well, the God of the Bible can't be accepted because he doesn't fit our modern values. As if our modern values are undeniably right. They believe they are. And we have to be able to answer this. So again, I ask the question of myself, why are we talking about this? Why would we even worry about having to take this on? You might be aware of a brother in Victoria who left the meeting about 5 years ago and wrote a letter to the whole brotherhood about why he resigned from the faith. He's now writing books to deconvert the Christadelphian movement. But his resignation letter said this week I resigned from the Christadelphian faith after 30 years. I resigned because I no longer believe in God. I'm not even sure there is a God. That's almost quoting Richard Dawkins, isn't it? Maybe there's no God. Perhaps there is, but he's not who I once thought he was. Almost implying that somehow God had changed. Who's changed here? Of the Bible, there was some wisdom there, but the attitudes to women and foreigners it describes, sometimes commands, were not worthy of the God I once believed in. And you see, his problem is, he thinks he has the right to judge and to put God in a box to say, well, you don't fit my criteria anymore. And he's walked away from the faith. And worse than that, he's trying to take other people away. And he's an intelligent, educated Christadelphian who used to do Bible schools and study weekends around this country. It just shows you how easily you can be undermined once you start taking in the wisdom and the reasoning of the world. And we have to be prepared to answer these challenges. So let's just remind ourselves of what we said the other night about the context of the law. It was written against the background of ancient cultures and moral codes. It had to improve and enhance and greatly go past the ancient codes of the world. It was written primarily and firstly to regulate an unspiritual nation of slaves, immature nation that didn't come out of Egypt with any law, code, priesthood, worship, anything to go by. But God's law was totally different to the existing nations. You go into the codes of Hammurabi and the others, there was torture, there was mutilation, there was slavery, and no respect for women at all. And it's amazing how many countries in the world haven't moved very far past that. Commit a crime in Saudi Arabia and see how you get on. Steal something in most Muslim countries and see what happens to your hand. You know, even in the modern world, there are many countries still back in those dark, dark ages. But God's law was very different. And we're going to talk about tonight genocide and slavery. But first, before that, let's just clear up an easy one. Was God a racist? Well, yes. In the modern definition of the term, God was racist. He chose one nation and put them on a pedestal above all the other nations. He did that to keep his promise to Abraham, that he would make of Abraham a great nation, that he might show in them his character, his power, his glory, and make them an example to the rest of the world. You are my witnesses, says God. People should come and look at you and say, this is a wise and understanding people who has a great law and a great God behind them. And God has always watched over Israel. He's chosen Israel to be his people. He's not cast away his people, says Romans 11. And in the kingdom, they will be the head of the nations, and men will say, you're a Jew, can we go with you to worship God? If that's what racism is, then God is a racist. Absolutely. He's chosen to do that. That's his prerogative. That's the way God's chosen to work in one family, the family of Abraham, and then in one nation. You know, God said to Israel these words, you shall not walk in the manners of the nation which I cast out before you, for they committed all these things, and I abhorred them. But I have said unto you, you shall inherit their land. I will give it to you to possess it. A land that floweth with milk and honey. I am Yahweh your God, which have separated you from other people. And you shall be wholly separated unto me. For I am Yahweh, am holy. And I've severed you from the other people, that you should be mine. And we have to appreciate that since the Jewish nation went into dispersion in AD 70, that God has now chosen to work with a little flock of those who have the faith of Abraham. He doesn't work with everybody. He's continued his practice of being selective. Not on a race basis anymore, not on a national basis, but on the basis of Abrahamic faith. And that's God's way of working, as God's prerogative. If men don't like it, they will disappear and God won't. We have to accept what God is and what he stands for. So let's come to the genocide, the annihilation of the Canaanites. You know, back to Abraham in Genesis 15, God said to Abraham, your seed will go to another land that is down into Egypt. They'll come forth in the fourth generation when the iniquity of the Amorites is full. The Amorites were the general description of the Canaanite nations as a whole. When the iniquity of the Amorites is full, says God, And that was 400 years away. That's a long time. And God was very patient. Like the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah. And he gave the Canaanites 400 years to change their ways. Until finally their religion was so depraved, so immoral, that God said even the children are corrupted by that religion, because they involved their children in their immoral worship. And God said, because I love Israel, and because I'm going to take those Canaanites away, that Canaanite religion has to be totally eradicated, and all the people have to go with it. And the modern world, and I wouldn't be surprised that many of you sitting there thinking, wow, that's tough. The modern world finds that abhorrent. We have to remember this is the same God that in the days of Noah obliterated possibly 2 billion people, including all the children and babies as well. Think about that. The same God that destroyed all the cities of Sodom and those around them, with all the inhabitants. And that's the God that made the heavens and the earth. That's the God that loves the world, but will not tolerate wickedness coming to the fore. So God said, yes, they have to go. Not because the Jews were any better. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going to possess their land. The reason that you are getting that land is because of the wickedness of these nations that I'm driving out. The time has come for them to be eradicated. You can inherit their land, not because you're any better than them. You're a stubborn people, and you're going to have a chance to stay there as long as you do the right thing. But in the end, God had to take them away as well, as he did in AD 70. But the time had come for the Canaanites to go, and that's why God commanded genocide. Let's just get some things right about God and the commands of war. God did require the absolute extermination of the Canaanites and their vile religion, with no exceptions allowed. That included the young children, many of whom were already corrupted at a young age. And that was because the Canaanites were especially immoral. And you don't need me, you can go and you can check up on what the Canaanite religion was based upon. It was all fertility rites, immorality amongst the gods, and served by immoral priests and priestesses. It was a shockingly immoral thing. Just pick up Rotherham's translation and read the summary at the front about the destruction of the Canaanites. And you will get an impression of why God said that. But for nations surrounding Canaan, if they were prepared to live at peace with Israel, they would not be disturbed. But if they attacked Israel, God then said, well, you can defend yourself against these nations. You can subdue them if they are causing and harassing you. But in the whole history of Israel, God never ever sent Israel out to conquer territory or take spoil just for the sake of it. It was only ever for the survival of the nation they were allowed to go to war. So you see, God did command the extermination of the Canaanites. That was his prerogative. So let's answer the question, does God approve genocide? That is, wiping out a whole nation? Yes, he does. There were 2 nations specifically to be wiped out. The Canaanites, of which there were 7 different races, and there was the Amalekites. And God said, utterly destroy them. Because in God's eyes, they were both a physical threat and a moral threat, especially to the nation of Israel that God had chosen. It was not the case with the Moabites and the Ammonites and all those others. If they lived in peace, Tyre and those, if they lived in peace with Israel, then they were not to be attacked. And God says, when he wants the wicked removed from the earth, he will do so. And at the coming of Christ and the beginning of the kingdom, there's going to be an expulsion and an eradication of those who generate and promote and revel in the evil that this world is so good at. You shall consider the place of the wicked, says Psalm 37, and it shall not be. You won't be able to find it. And God will wipe away the wicked. And we have to be in sympathy with God that he's going to do that. And here's the God of genocide. This is the God, yes, when it came to those two nations, because of their wickedness, their depravity, God said, wipe them all out. And that was his commandment to Israel to do so. So yes, God did command that they be taken away. What about slavery? Well, this is one of the main points of criticism of the law of Moses. And they say that God approved slavery. And when you think about slavery, most people think about the cruel, oppressive slavery that took place, taking people from Africa, transporting them to the West Indies and to America. It might surprise you to know that there were just as many slaves run by the British in the sugar-producing islands of the West Indies as there were in America producing cotton. We normally hear about the American ones more, but the British were running it just as well for the Jamaica and those sort of places, using slave labour there as well. And what they would do in those days was they would send over ships to Africa. Natives would round up other natives, and Arabs would round up natives, and bring them down to the ports and sell them to the captains of the ships, who would then transport them across in horrible conditions, crowded conditions, across the ocean, and drop them off in America or in the West Indies. And it was a cruel, cruel trade. The way they were shackled, dragged away from their families, chained up in ships in abominable conditions, and then sold at auction to the highest bidder. It became a disgraceful slave trade that we focused on in America. There they are being loaded into the holds of the ship. When they were sold, they could be treated, abused, both physically and sexually by their masters. It was a horrible, degrading trade, sold as chattels. So was the Bible condoning that type of slavery? Tragically, in the debate over slavery in America, many Christians used the Bible to justify the keeping of slaves in that way. But they were wrong. It's not the way the Bible said. Number one, this is why that sort of slave trade was completely and utterly wrong. You know, God's law totally banned that hopeless slavery, that forced slavery. And the Bible said this, in Deuteronomy and Exodus it said this, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of a man stolen and sold, shall be put to death. You really wonder, don't you, how people could try and use the Bible when it's absolutely clear that stealing people, forcing them into slavery, possessing slaves would be subject to death. But notice it's forced slavery. It's people stolen, forced into it, that actually come under that particular law. Now we need to understand that in the Bible, and particularly in the Old Testament, there were three types of servitude. And I'm changing the word from slavery to get away from the horrors that the word slavery normally entails. There were three categories of people who went into service in some way. The first category was totally distinct from the other two. The first category was Hebrew brethren, that is, fellow Jews who got into debt or had to pay a fine, didn't have the money and had to work it off. They had to borrow money and they had to work off that debt. Most of us here have had to borrow money and work off the debt for the rest of our lives. I owe, off to work I go. You know, that's what we all have to do in life, isn't it? But these were people who got into debt and had to leave their inheritance and go and work for somebody else to pay off the debt they'd actually incurred. So that was the first class, Hebrew brethren. They were treated very differently to the others. But there were people who were foreigners from outside Canaan. These are people that might have been in a city in Ammon or Moab somewhere that had resisted Israel. Cities been burnt, walls broken down, crops pillaged. What are they going to do to live? Well, they can either be slaughtered on the spot, which often happened in war in those days, or they could be willing to become a servant. There might also be exiles from other countries that were getting away from persecution or some poverty and would come into Israel willingly. But they couldn't own land because the land in Israel was owned by God and given to inheritance to each family. So you couldn't buy land if you were a foreigner. So you've got to work for your keep. So they became willing slaves. And there's a very big difference between being stolen and forced into slavery than actually saying, well, look, rather than you killing me, I'm happy to serve in Israel. And people choose to work in Israel. So those are the willing servants. The third class were the foreign servants who were bought from the Gentiles. These were people that actually had been bought in some slave market by perhaps an Ammonite or a Moabite. You need people to reap your fields. You go over there and you buy that slave to come and work for you. A bit like somebody getting a job offer, a higher job pay than what they're getting now. So you buy them to come and work for you. So there are three types of slaves. Now the first one is the Hebrews. The other two are the foreigners. And there are some different laws that apply to both classes of people. So bear in mind there are three types of servitude that we see in the law of Moses. Servitude, not forced slavery. So let's talk about the Hebrew brethren first. Hebrews employing Hebrews. Well, servitude happened because somebody's in debt. Maybe they've had a health problem. Maybe they've had a disaster on their property of something. Might be a disease went through. Or they've got a fine they have to pay off and they have to borrow to pay. Now, next in Deuteronomy 15, we read about what happens in the year of release. Every 7 years, every seventh year, debts were forgiven. So you might start in year 5 and year 6 or year 2, and it didn't matter how much your debt was. It wasn't, the person who was lending, the person who was employing could not sit down and say, oh, it's not worth me doing this. You had to look after your poor brother and provided what he needed. But come the year of release, and all debts were forgiven. He could then go back and resume farming his own inheritance. And we'll talk on Sunday, God willing, about how he was sent away. That's another issue altogether. But you had to treat them well because it's your brother. If you mishandled them, in other words, you struck them, you damaged them, you injured them, the debt was immediately cancelled and they walked free. Now that's very different to the slavery in America, where people were whipped into service, where they were threatened, beaten and abused. You had to treat those brethren well because it was your brother who was in debt, who was working for you to pay off his debt. So that's the kind of service that Hebrews went through. It was very different. Look what it says in Leviticus 25. If thy brother that dwelleth by thee be waxen poor and be sold unto thee, it doesn't mean he was sold like a chattel. It means he's put himself in your debt. You shall not compel him to serve as a bondservant. He's different to the other servants we're going to talk about later on. He had to be treated as a brother working off a debt, as a hired servant. All of you who work for bosses are hired servants, aren't you? Do you feel that that's slavery? No, because you choose to work there. You have to pay off your debts. As a hired servant, as a sojourner he shall be with thee, and shall serve thee unto the year of Jubilee. Now in the year of Jubilee, any mortgaged property went back to the original owners. He shall depart from thee, both he and his children with him, return to his own family, the possession of his father shall he return. So anyone in the year of Jubilee went straight back to their inheritance, or back to the original person granted it by God. And God says the reason this happens is they are my servants. They shall not be sold as bondmen. You can never sell somebody who's come to work for you to pay off their debts, not a Hebrew. And you shall not rule over him with rigour, but shall fear thy God. So when it come to Hebrew brethren, they had to be treated like they were just an employee. Treated well, looked after, and provided for. Here's just all the laws. I've just made a list of these laws that related to what it was for servants of Hebrews. In fact, nearly all of these laws, except the 6-year law, or the 7th year law, almost all of these conditions applied to foreign slaves as well. They had to be well treated and not oppressed. They could not be beaten or harmed. You know, if you knocked out his tooth because you lost your temper, he walked out the gate and the debt was forgiven. You're not going to swipe at him when he's doing that. The maximum term was 6 years for Hebrews, debt's in the 7th. And when you send him away, he's going home to a farm that probably hasn't been farmed for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. There's nothing in the barn. You had to say to him, look, take your wagon up to my barn, load it up as much as you like, go out and take the best of my flock, and go back to your inheritance. Does that sound like American slavery? You know, when they abolished slavery in America after the Civil War, there was a tremendous problem because all the slaves that were freed in the South went north into poverty because nobody was going to start paying them. These people went away, loaded up with goods. And in the year of Jubilee, any inheritances still mortgaged went back to their original owners. And that was the way that God treated the servants of the Hebrews. You know, here's how it was different to modern slavery. Servants were included in the family worship. You read that whenever they had a feast or a ceremony, you and your manservant and your maidservant were to get involved in that. When it came to keeping the Sabbath, servants had the day off. That's not what happens in most places where slavery occurs. It's 7 days a week. They could marry others in the household. They could choose a wife from those around them. They could elect to stay with their master. We read about that in Deuteronomy 15 here. They could elect to stay. They said, look, I love my master. I want to stay here. And that wouldn't happen if they hadn't been well treated, would it? And there are some people in life who actually cope better working for somebody else because they're not good managers. And they might choose to say, look, I'm better off and my family's better off if we stay here and we just work for a boss. You can choose to do that. But you wouldn't do it if you'd been mistreated. You'd be out of there like a rocket. We know what happened to those, of course. They made the commitment to stay. And that was a public declaration to formalise the fact that you had agreed to stay with that master for life. And everybody saw that happen, and it was put down, so the master was free from any accusation that he'd compelled you to do it. Because that's not a painless process. I don't recommend you try this at home, but that's not a painless process to go through that. But you did that because you were committed to stay in that house. It was a voluntary commitment to stay, and the employer was publicly seen that you had made that decision. You were not forced to stay there. You did it because you'd been well treated in that house. Now, one of the things the new atheists misconstrue is the way that daughters appear to have been sold into slavery to pay off family debts. Let's get this straight, what was actually happening. Exodus 21, verse 7 11. Just go there. We're talking here about Hebrew daughters going into Hebrew homes. So in verse 7, if a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, oh look, he's selling his daughter, that's slavery. Well, no, let's just get it in context. She shall not go out as the men servants do. In other words, she's not to be loaded up with heavy work that men would be expected to do. And then in verse 8, we come to this matter of the betrothal. Now let's just explain what's going on here. Where a family had got themselves into serious debt, the father could negotiate with somebody who had the money and perhaps had a son to marry, or even himself would marry his daughter. They could arrange a marriage to give her what her family could not provide, and maybe to pay off her father's debts. And this was usually an arranged marriage, and that was not an unusual thing in those times. I mean, Isaac and Rebekah was an arranged marriage. There were many of them in scriptures, and it was a custom of the ancient world. And in many countries, it's still the same. Now, we would have a problem with that, except when our children are coming up through the teenage years. We might think it's a good idea then. But arranged marriages were not unusual in the ancient world, not unusual in Bible times. So here was a case where, because the family was in some need, they would arrange a betrothal to the man or his son, and the girl would then go and work in that house until she married the individual, and then she would become part of that family, and the debt would be cancelled. She would end up having a much better life than perhaps her poor family could provide for her. But then what happens if she goes over there and the son changes his mind and says, I don't want to marry that girl? What happens to her? He marries somebody else. Well, what happened is that she had to be provided food, clothing and shelter. Otherwise, she could leave without cost and the debt was cancelled. So if they changed the contract, if they changed the deal, she could walk out. If she chose to stay in that house, then she had to provide all the necessities of life. And one thing God made incredibly clear, she was not to become a concubine or to be sexually abused. Quite specific about that. Now, maidservants were very much cared for by God. You know, while she was waiting to be married, or if she stayed on in the house as a maidservant, as we know from history, we know from current society, you go through the Middle East and see all the Asian women who've gone to work in Arab countries and have been treated as chattels, concubines, and worse. We're in a situation where maidservants were always protected by God. And here are the laws about maidservants. They could not be mistreated. See what it says in verse 26. If a man shall smite the eye of his servant, or the eye of his maid. And in all of these laws, we notice one thing that is so different to the laws of the ancient nations. That what applies to the man also applies to the woman. You smite her, you knock her eye out, knock her tooth out, then she can walk free. Her work was limited. She was not to be given dangerous work. She shall not go out and make her work alongside the men. Men were not to lust after this woman. No maidservant should be the subject of sexual unwanted attentions. They were specifically included in all the feasts and worship. You read all about every feast. You go up to Jerusalem, you and your maidservant. God includes them. They are to be part of the family worship. They were required to keep the Sabbath. She didn't work on the Sabbath. And look at back in Deuteronomy 15 and verse 12. These laws about when they were released, it says there in Deuteronomy 15 and verse 12, and if thy brother be sold, he shall go free from thee, you sin, he shall not go away empty. And there was this inclusion of the maidservants as well. In verse 12, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman came under this law of being provided for when they were sent away. And you just need to read carefully how different the law of God was to the ancient nations, in always including the woman in the protections that came with service and the laws of release. So God had a great care for maidservants. Now back in Exodus 21, I want to just clear up something which is one of the reasons why people can throw stones at the Old Testament, because of a very poor translation. In Exodus 21, this case of the girl who's been promised that she would marry the son or even marry the owner of the property, and they changed their mind. It says there in verse 9, if he's betrothed unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. Now, you treat your daughters well and with great respect. That's the way she was to be treated. If he takes another wife, her food, her raiment, her duty of marriage, he shall not diminish. And people say the duty of marriage was, there she becomes a concubine. Just add it on for the pleasure of the man. No. It's an incredibly unique Hebrew word. That word duty there is the word onah. It's the only time it occurs in the whole of the Old Testament. And it comes from a root which means oil or ointments, and going further back, dwelling or shelter. And what that's saying is that if somebody changes their mind and doesn't want to marry her, then she has to be provided for. Young's literal has her food, covering, and her habitation. ESV has her marital rights. In other words, her rights that she would be provided for and not left to fend for herself. She could never be sold to the Gentiles. She couldn't just say, well, we're going to sell her off, because she's been left in a very vulnerable position. She's been left in a situation where what she thought was going to happen isn't going to happen, but she has to be provided for, or she can go free. And you see, that's how God provided, that she was looked after and cared for. Now, you know, the new atheists would say, oh, you know, you could sell your daughter to pay off your debts. Well, no, there was a lot more to it than that. And if things did not work out in the arranged marriage, then she was certainly looked after and protected. She had to be treated in that house as one of the daughters of the house. So once you see what God's actually doing, the mockery and the criticism that is levelled at these laws is not justified. Now, what about the foreign slaves? Well, ancient times were cruel. In most wars, when people were captured in war, they were killed. In the case of Israel, or in the case of other nations, they become unpaid slaves. Now, the Romans and all the ancient empires built their empires on the backs of slaves who were captured, who were then put into service building roads and castles and all those things that they did, completely unpaid, 7 days a week, until they dropped dead of exhaustion. But not so with the foreign slaves. When we talk about foreign slaves in Israel, these are non-Jews who have become bondservants in Israel, because if you say go and destroy the city of Amman and you've got all these people you've captured, what do you do with them? Do you kill them? Or do you say to them, look, because you're not of the Amorites, because you're not of the wicked Canaanites we had to destroy, you can stay alive and come and work in Israel as servants in Israel. You can work for us, be treated well, and we'll look after you. Now, that was the law that the Gibeonites exploited. Remember, the Gibeonites came to Joshua, all pretending they'd come from a far country. You know, all their bread was mouldy and their shoes were worn out. Oh, we come from a far country. You know, we want to make peace with you. And Joshua accepted them. And the Gibeonites came into Israel. God honoured the contract that Joshua had made, even though it had been achieved by deception. He honoured the contract, and they became bearers of water. In other words, they brought the water up for the temple services, they brought it up for the tabernacle. Finding the wood for the sacrifices was their job. And the Gibeonites survived alive in Israel, even though they were Canaanites. That God honoured it, because they came under the protection of that law, that they could serve in Israel in those capacities. And they still had to be well treated. They could not be abused because they'd got it by trickery. And those foreign people who chose to work, and some, of course, would be people who were perhaps persecuted in their home country, would come down to Israel and say, I'll work for my living. I can't own land, but I feel safe here, I'll work for my living. And so they would sign up and they would work for their living. And while they're there, they can convert to Judaism. They can accept the worship of the Jews and the God of Israel, and then become part of the feast and the worship of the nation. And it's believed that the Gibeonites who came into Israel became known as the Nethinims. By the time of David and Samuel, and right into the time of Nehemiah, you find the Nethinims were absolutely essential to the operation of the temple. And they were the Gibeonites who chose to become Jews. They became the Nethinims. So, you see, that was foreign slaves who were kept alive or chose to come to Israel that they might work for a living. That's not the slavery of the American kind. But there was a third class. Just summarising again, Jews could have Gentile servants. Often they were people spared in war or willing immigrants. They could not own land, they had to work for a living. If they'd been bought from Gentiles to become workers, they were regarded as the property of the owner. Now, there was another class, the third class, who actually had been purchased from Gentiles to come into the land. So a Jew would go to another country, he would say, look, I need workers. And of course, they had a value to the people who had them under their control. They might have captured them in war themselves. They might have forced them into slavery. It doesn't really matter. The Jew would say, I'll give you this money, they come and work for me. And that's what we call slaves who had been bought. And they were regarded as the property of the owner. So if you actually hurt one of those slaves, it would cost you because the owner has lost something of value. Now, another important fact is that a runaway slave, somebody who was a slave in another country, who ran away from his master, you could not send him back to his master. You know, God was specific. Just come to Deuteronomy 23 and verse 15. It says, thou shalt not deliver, this is Deuteronomy 23 verse 15, thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in the place which he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him. You think about the beauty of this law. Here's a man that's been a slave in another country. Perhaps he was forcibly put into slavery. He escapes and comes running into Israel. He can pick where he's going to live. He can pick who he's going to work for. He's not to be oppressed, and he shall dwell among you. And they had to think of the soul of the stranger in that position. If you've ever read the book or seen the movie called Roots, you will know what happened in America when slaves ran away. They had bounty hunters who were paid to hunt down escaped slaves, who would chase them right up into the northern states with dogs and guns. And when they caught the slaves who'd run away more than once, they cut off their toes to slow them down so they wouldn't run away again. That's the cruel slavery of the Americas. How different is that you read there in Deuteronomy 23? They could choose wherever they went to work for whoever they wanted to, and they were not allowed to be taken back to their master that you might get a reward for him. Again, the law of mistreating servants applied even to foreign servants. You damaged them, you bashed them up, you abused them, they could walk out, even if you'd paid for them. So it was wise and economic to treat your slaves well. And in all the laws, when you read about why they should do this, God just said this. God said, remember, you were once slaves in Egypt. And you probably didn't enjoy the way the Egyptians treated you with whips and taking away the straw and making you work harder and harder to make bricks. Remember that when you come to deal with those less fortunate than yourself. So that's how the Old Testament dealt with the three categories of service. Remember that Hebrew brethren treated very differently. Looked after, cared for, released with bundles of goodies to take away. The foreign slaves, either spared in war, willing exiles who came into Israel, runaway slaves who turned up to get away from oppression somewhere else. They worked for their living and their support, and they could have families and get married. All of those things they could do, and they could join Israel and become part of the nation. But always they were cared for. Even the maidservants were totally protected from abuse. That's totally different to the slavery of the Americas and even some of the modern world. What about slavery in the New Testament? Well, Jesus was concerned to provide individual salvation, individual character development. When Jesus came, his law was not about regulating ungodly nations. It was about the individual. He wasn't at that stage going to transform the world by his teaching. He was transforming individuals. And he's still doing that now. But the time has come when he will transform the world. But in the first century, in the Roman world, slavery was a fact of life. It was there. It was entrenched in the Roman system, and believers, slave owners and slaves had to work around the world into which they had come. And that's why in Corinthians it says, let every man abide in the calling. If you've been called as a slave, stay as a slave. Don't agitate for your freedom. Take that as God's will that you should work as a slave. If you're a slave master, treat your slaves well. But of course, the challenge was harder for the slave master, wasn't it? Because the culture was, the slave is yours, body and soul. You can be bought and sold as you choose, used as you choose, and abused as you choose. That was the way the Romans treated their slaves. But once you come into the truth and you become aware of how God views service, and especially when that slave becomes a convert to the truth, haven't things changed? And we have an example of that in the book of Philemon. Philemon was a slave owner, come into the truth. He had a slave that had run away and found Paul in Rome and found the truth in Rome. Onesimus, sent back to his master Philemon with a letter from Paul, which was incredibly wise in the appeal it made to Philemon, not commanding him to do anything, but just reminding Philemon of what God had done for him, of what Paul had done for him in bringing the truth into his house, and pointing out that Onesimus and he would have to share eternity together. What do you think Philemon was going to do with Onesimus? Beat him to death because he ran away? Make an example of him for the other slaves? Or make him a free man? I think you both know the answer. If Philemon was truly conscious of what God had done for him, he would release a converted slave and make him one of the family. But you see, they had to live with what society dictated to them. That was the world in which the truth had to make progress. And there would be slaves and there would be slave owners. So I hope in that little brief consideration, and we will be giving out accessibility to all the PowerPoint presentations so you can actually go through it a bit closer yourselves, but I just hope that we can see how ill-informed the new atheist movement is about what the Bible said about slavery in particular. But they were not ill-informed about genocide or racism. But you see, that's the standard of the modern world, that you can't choose one nation above another. You can't wipe out people who are immoral, but God can. And we have to accept that as a difference. God was racist, is selective. You and I sit here because we are the chosen elect of God. Not because we deserve it, not because we're more righteous than anyone out there, but that's God's choosing. And we have to rejoice in that and be thankful for that and be humbled by that. But that's God's prerogative. And God will take away the wicked as he did with the flood in Sodom, AD 70. He will do that again. But when it comes to slavery, God's law was far ahead, far more beneficial, far more enlightened than all the codes of the ancient world, and gave men the opportunity to show that they believed and understood the compassion and the kindness and the mercy and the provision of God in their lives. And they would do that to their brethren and those who worked for them. And so we conclude that God is not a moral monster. This is the God we serve. And now, Israel, what doth Yahweh thy God require of thee? But to fear Yahweh thy God, to walk in all his ways and to love him, and to serve him with all thy heart and with all thy soul, to keep the commandments of Yahweh and his statutes which I command thee this day for thy good. Behold, the heaven of the heavens is Yahweh thy God. The earth also and all that is therein is. Only Yahweh had a delight in thy fathers to love them, and he chose their seed after them, even you above all people. And we are, by the grace of God, the seed of Abraham alive today. And God's chosen us, and we should be thankful for that. So, brethren and sisters, don't let the world poison your mind by their concept of judging God by the twisted values of the postmodern age and concluding that God is a moral monster. Be prepared to stand up and defend God and to show them that what the Bible said about service has got nothing to do with the slavery with which they accuse God.